Welcome to Leveraging the Laboratory, a Mayo Clinic Laboratories podcast for administrators, outreach managers, and laboratory professionals to learn how best to leverage and optimize the laboratory for patients, clients, and staff. I'm your host, Jane Hermansen, Outreach Manager for Mayo Clinic Laboratories. And joining me today, perennial favorite, is Shannon Bennett. Shannon is the Director of Quality and Regulatory Affairs for the Department of Laboratory Medicine and Pathology for Mayo Clinic. So our discussion topic today is going to be the complex and ever-changing world of laboratory industry regulations. Shannon, as I already said, this is your perennial visit. It's your annual visit to our Leveraging the Laboratory podcast. Tell me a little bit about yourself and your role within Mayo Clinic for our audience, please.
So as the Director of Regulatory Affairs, I and my team help our laboratories interpret the various regulations, accreditation standards, and so on that our laboratories need to follow. And we also will help them, brainstorm the best way to be compliant with these rules in a way that still works for them operationally.
So what you are is the guy that gets to interpret all of that regulatory alphabet soup and boil it down into a way that it makes sense for those of us in the lab who need to be compliant with all the rules. Is that an easy way to say it?
Yeah, right.
Pretty much. Fantastic. Okay. So of the alphabet soup things that keep us up at night, I think there are a number of them, right? But why don't we start with the one that really came to kind of a head and brought some findings finally this year, was the FDA regulation ruling related to laboratory developed tests. For our audience, Shannon, maybe you could tell us a little bit about what that is, just kind of the Cliff Notes version, and then we'll expand and talk about that from an outreach program perspective. Sound okay?
The audience knows there are basically two types of tests. You have in vitro diagnostic kits, which are manufactured by commercial test manufacturers, and you have laboratory developed tests. And historically, FDA has not regulated LDTs. They have tried over the last probably 10 or so years to take a more active role in regulating LDTs, largely unsuccessfully. And then this past May, they passed new regulations that officially, formally grants them the authority to regulate LDTs. And so they have a 4-year transition timeline to begin slowly phasing in these requirements. And the first milestone is coming up in this coming May 2025. And it is related to adverse event reporting or non-conforming event reporting and complaint handling.
Can you go into a little bit more detail? So the complaint handling, adverse report handling, those would be related to tests that are done a lab developed platform. Is that correct?
Correct. So if a laboratory wants to continue offering any LDTs, they all need to comply with this first milestone. So the first piece, the non-conforming event reporting, is likely something most labs will already have in place. It may need to be expanded upon, but essentially you need a mechanism to identify and document when you have a non-conformance with your test. And now the new thing is potentially some of those may need to be reported to the FDA. So certainly if a patient was harmed due to an inaccurate test result, that would certainly need to be submitted to the FDA in what they call a medical device report, or an MDR. And there may be some other events that occur that would need to be reported to the FDA. The other new piece, which might be a little bit of a steeper climb for laboratories, is around complaint handling. So laboratories will need a mechanism to receive complaints and have those complaints reviewed in a standardized way by a standardized group, and then identify if those complaints need to be investigated or not. And if the decision is made not to further investigate them, documenting why not and who made that decision. And then if an investigation occurs and it is determined that that complaint is substantiated and is related to the design of an LDT, again, that may need to be reported to the FDA. So if someone calls your laboratory and says, I don't think this test result is accurate, that's a complaint. So now you need to start using that complaint process, most likely investigate. And again, if it's true that it was an inaccurate result from your LDT, and it caused patient harm, that would be reportable to the FDA.
And that's a change for regular laboratories. Is this how instrument and device manufacturers have always had to follow FDA rules?
Yes. So these are the same requirements that all other medical device manufacturers need to follow. And that really is what the regulatory change this past May is FDA now considers lab developed tests to be medical devices, just like IVD kits, MRI machines, hip implants. We're all in the same family now as far as FDA is concerned.
Got it. Okay. So it's kind of a different world, but perhaps the laboratory industry doesn't have to reinvent the wheel. There are some clear processes that have already been developed.
Yes.
Perfect. Well, that was actually news to me, so thank you for sharing that. So, of course, you know that the main focus of this podcast is to look at laboratory outreach programs. And a lot of groups are saying, well, I don't know how my LDTs play into the bigger picture of my outreach program. Are you able to expand at all on what the LDT ruling means for the health system or for a laboratory outreach program overall?
So, as I mentioned earlier, if a laboratory wants to offer LDTs at all, they will need to comply with the first two milestones. So, beginning this coming May, you will need to comply with those medical device reporting requirements and the complaint requirements. Even if you're only running LDTs you've had on your menu for the last 10 years, you will still need to comply with that. The other implication for reference lab businesses or referral businesses that ultimately any new LDT that comes to market after May of this past year. So if you have a new LDT that went online today, eventually you will need to submit that to the FDA. The FDA will need to approve your new LDTs unless they have a number of what they call enforcement discretion categories. So for example, if your LDTs are reviewed and approved by the state of New York, that's an enforcement discretion category. You would not need to submit your test to the FDA for approval. You may need to meet other requirements, quality requirements, but you would need to submit to FDA. One of those enforcement discretion categories is I have an LDT that I offer only to patients seen at my healthcare institution, that's only ordered by physicians at my healthcare institution, and is for an unmet need. Okay, so there's a lot there. Let's break it down.
Yep, right.
So first of all, unmet need. So that means that there isn't an FDA authorized version of that test on the market to be used. Okay. So if you're testing a particular analyte and there's an FDA authorized kit for that same analyte, same intended use, your LDT won't qualify for that enforcement discretion category. Okay. So let's say that you have an LDT for some kind of a rare disease and there are no other tests on the market for it. You can qualify for that enforcement discretion category and not have to submit to FDA if you only test your patients at your hospital. So this is where the reference lab piece comes in, is that test would not be eligible for reference testing. So you could not accept specimens from other laboratories or hospitals in your area or from out of state, etc., because they are not your patients. So that means labs are going to face I think, a difficult decision. I don't really want to submit to FDA because that's a lot of work and expense. So maybe I'll try to fall into that enforcement discretion category, but that means I can no longer offer it outside of my four walls, which has a lot of negative connotations, of course, patient care implications, revenue implications. I think, particularly for those low volume tests, you might not have enough test volume at your site to warrant having that test up and running, but maybe due to the samples you can bring in from other affiliated hospitals, now you do. Well, again, if you cut off that source of test volume, maybe it's no longer financially viable for you to run that test. So I think it's going to force laboratories to make some very difficult decisions regarding their test menus.
Well, I really appreciate that explanation of keeping it within the health system, because for some that may be adequate and that may actually be enough for them without having to go through the extra work. So I guess my last question related to this, you talked about a 4-year plan. the first two steps that people must meet by next spring. Are there any tips that you have to give folks, just any ideas to get a head start on being compliant with this new FDA ruling on LDTs?
So I think the biggest thing is educate yourself. You need to know and understand what the requirements are, when the due dates are, because again, the expectation will be that laboratories comply at each milestone with the necessary requirements. So milestone 1 and milestone 2, which goes into effect in May of 2026, are required for all LDTs. Okay. So even if you're not planning on introducing new LDTs anymore, you still need to comply with those first two. So you have a couple of options. Thankfully, there are a lot of resources available out there. So certainly many professional societies are creating resources for their membership. The Clinical and Laboratory Standards Institute, which is a not-for-profit organization that creates guidance documents and best practices, they have an LDT resources page that can be leveraged. And then finally, FDA has an informational page as well. And they've been holding a series of webinars, for example. And so at the very least, I would suggest downloading the slides from those presentations, if not watching the presentations themselves. But really try to use multiple resources to educate yourself on the requirements so that you can start making educated decisions on how do we comply, where do we need to comply, what do we do with our tests.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. So let's talk about PAMA, the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. Clearly, we've been living with this since 2018, I believe. The first time I heard about it was 2013. So it's been part of our laboratory vernacular for quite a while. Why don't you give us a quick recap on what it is, current status, what's coming up next?
So PAMA is the Protecting Access to Medicare Act. It was passed quite a number of years ago. It was a large bill, did a lot of different things, but one of the things it did is it sought to control healthcare costs. And so that means that CMS, the Center for Medicare and Medicaid Services, which handles Medicare and Medicaid, so a significant reimbursement source, was tasked with looking at ways to control costs. And so the way they did that is they surveyed laboratories for pricing information with the intent of using that to essentially set national prices. The challenge with that is a lot of that data came from very large, high capacity laboratories who have economies of scale. So of course, the reimbursement levels that came back from that data exercise were significantly lower than I think a lot of labs would expect or would like. In some cases, you would have seen cuts of 15 to 20% for your reimbursement, which is obviously significant. So various stakeholders have been pushing Congress to essentially fix that, to introduce legislation to essentially tweak how that data is gathered and the way it is assessed to make it more reasonable and realistic. So the American Clinical Laboratory Association has been pushing a piece of legislation for the last few years called SALSA, the Saving Access to Laboratory Services Act. Unfortunately, SALSA has not gotten over the finish line despite multiple attempts. However, what ACLA has been able to achieve, along with congressional partners, is delays in these price cuts. I think we've had 3 or 4 of them now. And again, this year, there's been another 1-year delay in those price cuts, which is good. But the thing that should keep laboratories up at night to some extent is that we have to keep going back to that well every single year. And does it come to a point where 1 year Congress doesn't pass that 1-year extension, and now we're hit with these massive decreases in reimbursement? So, ACLA and other organizations certainly will continue trying to push SALSA next year, but this saga continues.
Well, and clearly none of us want more cuts for laboratory. We had 3 years of cuts, and then pandemic hit and put everything on pause. So if anybody is clearly inspired to reach out to your congressman and have them support getting rid of PAMA, Shannon, if I'm hearing you right, SALSA is the approved method forward if we want good long-term relief for this.
The goal of SALSA really is to change the math that is being used. Not, certainly not to get rid of PAMA, but to use, better data gathering techniques to be more representative of the industry as a whole.
Well, I think that's a really good point, because I think what I heard is that the first PAMA rates were set when they looked at the groups, the laboratories that had actually submitted data. Only 24 or so hospitals were included in that data set. Everything else came from the independent laboratory, but the hospitals were the ones that were actually impacted the most by these cuts.
Yes.
And you can, as we know, we can only cut so much. So I appreciate that. So let's keep our fingers crossed that SALSA catches a little bit more favor and we're able to move toward a better way of managing this in the future. All right. Next thought that I had is, so you've talked about some advocacy groups, some lobbying groups and associations that actually advocate for the laboratory industry. Do you have any tips for someone who has never actually gotten engaged in the whole politic thing? Some people love it and other people can't stand it. So how do you encourage someone who says, boy, I've never actually even talked to a politician before, but I feel really, really passionate about making sure that my laboratory doesn't experience another round of cuts, for example. How can an average person actually make this happen in their community and reach out to someone from one of their elected officials and get some help?
I mean, I guess the obvious answer is every, one of our Congress folks have, contact information on their webpage. Certainly you can reach out that way. I'll again point to professional societies. So I think all of the major professional societies in the lab industry have some sort of a government outreach function. Quite a few of them have what they'll call a Hill Day, where they'll actually bring members of the organization to the Hill to speak with congressional staffers on lab-related topics. So that's a really good mechanism there. So I think that's probably where I'd start. Another potential option is, reach out and invite them to visit your laboratory. Education is a huge component of making sure that legislators are making decisions that are beneficial for laboratories. Talking about how important we are to the healthcare ecosystem, talking about the negative impact of things like, FDA regulations or PAMA or things like that. So just, use your voice. That is the most important thing.
And one thing that I know is that many organizations are very cautious about having their employees reach out and then using their work email addresses. So please, if anybody's listening to this and says, oh, this is fantastic, please make sure you know your organization's policies before you reach out, so that you're doing it with your personal email address and you're not overstepping and representing your organization in any way that may not be what is in step with what their goals are.
That's a great point, Jane. Really, really important point. Be familiar with your laboratories, advocacy policies, social media policies as well. If you're posting on Facebook or LinkedIn about, FDA or whatever, because you don't want to, run afoul of your institution's policies, but you also don't want to create confusion with, XYZ hospital said this, but yet this employee said something different, what's going on here. So just be very clear that you're speaking on behalf of yourself, or you're speaking on behalf of, this professional society that you're doing a Hill Day with, and that sort of thing.
I really appreciate that. And truly, it's time. Our time has gone by very fast, as it always does, Shannon. I could learn so much from you every single day. But I think my favorite closing question for you especially is because you are so in touch with everything that's happening. Can you share with us real quickly what your favorite sources of information are? Stuff that's easy to understand, easy to access for the normal laboratory leader who might want to know more.
So, there are innumerable newsletters and websites and so forth. One that I use for kind of just general industry news is 360DX. So 360, they've got a nice daily newsletter about what's going on in the industry. Many professional societies have some kind of journal or newsletter. That's another great resource that you can use. And then finally, specific to FDA, they also have a daily news digest, essentially, of what's going on with the agency. So that's another great resource to stay on top of new guidance documents or upcoming webinars or things like that.
So I hope our audience has written those down. Those are some great, great tips. And Shannon, like I said, our time has gone so quickly today, and thank you. I hope that the audience today has gained some new information related to what's happening in the world of regulations, especially how it impacts lab. And truly, we want to make sure that our laboratories are providing the highest quality of service to their patients and the communities, and the regulations are certainly in place to make sure that that happens. So I can't thank you enough, Shannon. Have a wonderful day.
Thanks.
And thank you for listening to Leveraging the Laboratory, a podcast from Mayo Clinic Laboratories. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. And until next time, we encourage you to continue to promote your community-based hospital laboratory. The needs of the patient come first.